Welcome to the Pharma Source podcast. Joining us today is Danie Rossetto, Head and SVP of Supply Chain and External Manufacturing at ARTBIO, where he's navigating the complex world of radiopharma supply chains. With over 17 years leading high-speed agile supply networks across biotech and pharma, including senior roles at Novartis, Daniel brings deep expertise in external manufacturing partnerships and launch readiness. So Daniel, welcome to the podcast and a Happy New Year to you.
Thanks, Luke. Yes, thanks very much for the very good introduction, and Happy New Year to you and to all the listeners.
Looking forward then to really getting into this fascinating area of radiopharma and some of those specialized challenges within the sector. To start with, we're seeing major acquisitions across big pharma. So looking at Novartis or AstraZeneca, BMS, Eli Lilly, it really feels like everyone's piling into radiopharma right now. What's driving all this attention, and why has this become such a strategic priority for big pharma?
It's an interesting question, as the use of radioisotopes is not actually that new. This modality has been used for a long time for diagnostic purposes, mainly, but also for some therapeutic. I suppose, though, the real boom of interest has come only in recent years as more results from clinical studies, broader clinical studies have come to life at larger scale, and for the therapeutic purposes in particular, and have actually shown what great results it can yield. And talking of showing, this is exactly part of the concept, and I guess where the interest also lies, because it's all based on seeing the diseases that can be cured and then actually treating what is seen in a quite detailed way. So probably that's also where some of the interest actually lies. So because of this, radiopharma today is considered one of the advanced modalities. And I suppose it has been difficult in the past for larger companies to pivot from products that would not fit maybe in the typical infrastructure of big pharma, and consider this more and more as a mainstream product as it's happening now. There are different challenges that had to be first overcome, such as the type of manufacturing and logistic infrastructure, the capabilities, and slightly different know-how than that is needed to make, supply, and manage radiopharmaceuticals from the starting materials all the way to the patient. In fact, part of the acquisitions you mentioned were most probably to get a head start, not only on products, but actually on the infrastructure and knowledge. So the possibilities are many, thanks to the combination of different molecules and radioactive isotopes, which are opening up the potential to possibly treat a variety of diseases in the years to come. And that's probably where I would imagine a lot of these big pharmas are interested in.
What about you yourself, Daniel? What was it that attracted you to the world of radiopharma?
Yeah, well, honestly, at the beginning, I think it was almost an opportunity that I wasn't fully aware of what it meant to be in radiopharma. But what really then became interesting was the fact that it's a combination of maybe traditional pharma, where I had been working for quite some years before, but also new aspects that I just didn't know about, which is actually the part around managing radioactivity, one of the components of radiopharmaceuticals. And probably the most interesting part for me is the fact that due to one of the aspects, which is around the fact that these products have a very, very short shelf life, you're connected, especially in a role like supply chain and manufacturing, you're connected across the whole value chain at every single step, from starting materials all the way through to actually getting the product to the patient. So you're not lost in between, let's say, different steps, shipping products between warehouses, many different parties involved, but you're really looking across the whole chain. And that's where, for me, it becomes very, very exciting to be part of it.
It is a particularly complex and time-sensitive supply chain, and I think really, elevates supply chain to a strategically important position within the whole business. In our conversation before this episode, you described radiopharma as managing a block of ice and having to get it to the other side of the desert. I wonder if you could paint a picture of that. So what happens from when the clock starts ticking, the moment that a patient's identified? What does that look like?
Yes, Luke, this is definitely one of the most important factors in radiopharma. I suppose briefly to explain what is radiopharmaceutical. As the name says, it is a pharmaceutical, and therefore is produced following the same rules and regulations and using very similar materials as other medical products. What makes, however, radiopharmaceutical special is that one of the main components is actually a radioactive isotope. So now, many people get scared by this word. We are, though, talking about very, very small quantities, and mostly about isotopes that have what we call a half-life of just hours or a few days. What this means is the activity, or in other words, the potency of the isotope, halves every few hours or days. At the same time, each dose is made typically for a specific request, given that the activity at the moment of the injection, so the use of the actual product, is determined beforehand, which results in most of the time that the product is made to order and has a shelf life only of few hours or days. And of course, being a radioactive isotope, you don't want and should not be producing huge amounts beforehand. So the race, as you called it correctly, literally starts clicking in the moment that the isotope part of the radiopharmaceutical is made. So, like you said, it's like an ice block that needs to be made and transported in the middle of the summer under the scorching sun in the desert, and you have no means to protect it or to cover it. So it just will continue melting. And the same happens with radioisotopes that have so-called natural decay, which is what we described before with the half-life. So every minute literally counts to make sure the dose is made and received at the right time for it to be both effective and safe for patients.
Hmm.
What this also means is that for this particular part of the product, it is always almost impossible to maintain a stock as it just melts away without being able to stop it. And this is also one of the peculiarities in radiopharma.
What does that mean then, Daniel, in practical terms to the supply chain and external manufacturing strategy? I mean, how do you deal with that? The fact that you can have no safety stock and the inventory has to move fast.
Yeah. So inventory, as you say, I mean, it's an important part of managing usually any supply chain. And of course, also in radiopharma, there are some parts and some materials that can be managed also in the same way. However, as I mentioned just before, one of the key components, the radioactive one, is very difficult to be maintained or would be far too costly. So one of the aspects that we do look in radiopharma is where you can actually decouple what can and cannot be stockpiled, including also certain steps of the radioactive component. And be laser focused, though, in managing all the aspects that are the impacting the race against the clock. So to give you an example, some radioisotopes do have a starting material which is stable, which means it does not decay or, like we said before, melt away.
Mhm.
That those material need to be irradiated or processed in a reactor. And yes, I actually mean a nuclear reactor here. So from that moment onwards is where everyone involved in the manufacturing and getting the product through the value chain to the final customer, so actually being the patient, are making sure that nothing happens that could stop it. And consider that there are always predictable, but also many unpredictable situations. So it's all about the oversight and having as many alternative plans as possible. And in terms of manufacturing, it's about having the right setup of possibly using a certain maybe overcapacity in place or as a kind of a safety stock in order to build as much flexibility and resilience to the process.
What does that mean then for supplier selection? So partnering with CDMOs in this type of specialist market. I mean, is there a particular capabilities, obviously, and infrastructure which you're looking for, which are set up, but also is there a certain mentality perhaps, or how do you find the right type of partners to be able to orchestrate this complex, fast-moving supply chain?
No, definitely. I mean, as I mentioned, flexibility and resilience to the process. So CDMO selection becomes very, very important. And here, in addition, it's very often specialized CDMOs that have capabilities and infrastructure, whether it's licenses, it's manufacturing and laboratory equipment, could be storage areas for some of the waste that is generated to manage the pharmaceutical part that is actually radioactive. So having the right partner that understands and of course has the right capabilities across each step is very, very important,
Hmm.
as this type of work requires, as you rightly said, the right mindset. And it's about probably all the steps in the chain. I wouldn't say it's only the manufacturing part, so probably the CDMO, as typically called, but it's about every part of it, whether it's the suppliers of certain parts of the material, which are usually made specifically for radiopharmaceuticals, the manufacturer, of course, but also the logistic companies that also understand the speed at which we need to move from A to B, and everyone that's actually involved in the whole chain.
How many partners typically are there when you're going from the reactor all the way through to the patient? How many different parties are you trying to orchestrate?
It depends probably on the complexity of how the supply chain is set up, and it depends on the technologies that are used. But it could be anywhere between five and probably about 15 to 20 different players from the
Oh,
very
wow.
start to the end point. And it's some of them are concurrent, so being managed at the same time. And it's a very good network where people know each other very well. And very often, actually, the communication doesn't necessarily have to come only through a central point, but it happens also horizontally. And that's the nice thing in this industry where it's a lot about the cross collaboration about among all the partners.
Yeah. 15 partners, let's say. I mean, that feels like there's lots of potential points of failure, which could be there. Getting into the detail of how you actually manage that, how do you have that overview of what's happening? Is there a system, a technology which can help with managing capacity through that whole flow?
Yeah, I mean, there are systems, I would say, that are built and help oversee. Also, very much about how and where the product is at every stage of the process. A lot about is managing also the capacity, as we mentioned before. So being able to always have some flexibility in case of the unexpected happening.
Mm,
So I would say. There are very often these are still custom made because it does depend on how the system is set up and the process is set up. But it becomes extremely important to have that kind of oversight and overview.
mm. Wonder if you could share any examples of what happens when things don't go according to plan. I mean, are there backup plans, scenario plans to deal with unexpected situations? And when something does go wrong, how do you keep that critically important isotope moving?
Yeah, I mean, we often call Murphy's Law, right? So
Mm,
this happens quite often, and when something does go wrong, then usually it's a whole chain of events that gets triggered. So to give you an example, in some cases, like I mentioned before, to make radiopharmaceuticals, a nuclear reactor is needed to make specifically the one that has to be managed very quickly, so the isotope itself.
mm.
There are several reactors worldwide that operate for this specific reason. There can be so-called research reactors, but also in more recent years, some power reactors that have started some application to support also this medical industry.
Just to explain the difference there, then,
Yeah.
a research reactor, is that set up specifically to deal with pharma?
No, not only. So research reactors are usually a bit smaller reactors
Uh-huh.
in terms of the power that's used, and it's used for research purposes, whether it's research of materials, so not just pharma. It could
Okay.
be
Yep.
testing materials, but also for isotopes used in various applications, including medical application.
Great.
Whilst the
Okay.
power reactors would be the ones typically used to make energy, electricity,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
which have recently, in a few cases, started also adding some technology to be used to make also medical isotopes.
So the current existing infrastructure of nuclear reactors set up for traditional power, some of them could be retrofitted.
Correct, yes, exactly. So that's something that has been happening, I would say, probably only in the recent years. So research
Mm,
reactors have been around for decades now. And in more recent years, probably because of the interest and the growth of this industry, some larger, so the power reactors, the ones that are
mm.
making electricity, have well, on one side shown interest, but actually have implemented certain technologies, developed and implemented technologies, also to irradiate isotopes for, in our case, to make also medical isotopes.
So what does that mean then in terms of backups and switching from reactors?
It has happened that sometimes during planned downtime. So each reactor does have a time where it has to go down for maintenance work. But it has happened that sometimes they have had an extended need for the downtime, which was unexpected,
Hmm.
which could then cause a shortage in, for our case, in actual medical isotopes. So one of the key ways to be ready for this eventuality is to have alternatives and backups ready all the time, so it can be switched very, very quickly, and reduce, and of course, if possible, completely avoid any disruptions further down the line. And if you remember this example when you were asking about the race against time, well, this is exactly where it starts, by the production of the isotopes. So any disruption needs to be managed and coordinated extremely quickly.
Mhm.
And with having a global network of different reactors, this is where this can be somehow at least reduced, if not completely avoided.
Thinking about that whole supply chain direct to patient, what kind of efficiencies does that need? Because presumably you can't wait for 28 days of sterility testing when a product can decay in hours. What does that mean from a regulatory point of view? Are regulators comfortable with working in that kind of environment? And what does it take operationally?
Yeah. Well, operationally, of course, it means that everything has to move as fast as possible.
Mm.
There are ways and methods to test, well, manufacture, of course, to start, but then test and release products as quickly as possible. It is true there are some specific regulations that apply for radiopharmaceuticals, albeit, however, still a pharmaceutical, so it definitely has to be produced as a pharmaceutical and following the same type of regulations.
Mm.
Um, there is, of course, in the later years, more and more attention and more innovation that's coming through, including automation, whether it's in how material is handled during production, QC testing, but also on the logistics sides to really try and reduce any impact of delays and time that is needed for important steps, but that can just take too long for what is the shelf life of the product.
Mm.
And in a way, also technology is coming in with looking at alternative ways of manufacturing, especially as keep on coming back to the isotope part. So the part where the time does start ticking. And there is innovation in using, for example, other technologies such as cyclotrons. They've been around some time, but the way they've been used maybe has been changing in recent years, or linear accelerators, or even generators, which are bringing also a new way of working with radiopharmaceuticals to the market.
Given the importance of how critical it is to everything that happens in the business, what does that mean internally at the company? I mean, when you're sat around the board table with your peers, what kind of questions do you get asked? What kind of KPIs does everyone look at?
Yeah. No, that becomes very important, of course, because it's not like in other cases where you have more buffers in between, right?
Hmm.
So if something goes wrong, maybe it's a small glitch at some point in the value chain, but there's no necessarily big impact at the actual customer side because there might be buffers in between. So here, anything that happens definitely has a direct impact and gets seen straight away.
Hmm.
So KPIs, or let's say what becomes very important is making sure that every time every product is made, and everyone is really trying to ensure it's right first time. So ensuring that the product can be brought to the patient, and then of course on time delivery. In full is maybe a bit different here because in full, in our cases, every dose that's made is for a patient, as it's then shipped directly to the hospital where the patient is being treated. So it will always be in full if it's delivered, of course, and the on time is what becomes extremely important because even just a few hours could make the difference between being able to use that dose or not.
Hmm.
So I would say those are really the type of KPIs and topics that are looked at management level and across the company, because that is really the driver to get and use radiopharmaceuticals at the patient level.
Given that you've worked across the industry in various different roles, do you feel as though it's perhaps more of a strategic priority in a space like radiopharma with the half-lives, constant decay, than it would be in other more traditional modalities, for example?
Yeah.
Is it front of everyone's mind?
Yeah, I would say the focus is higher because, as I mentioned before, if something happens, then the impact is immediate.
Mm,
So, of course, also in traditional pharma, everything has some kind of impact. It could be a cost impact. It could have a delivery impact as well. But here, of course, it's relevant from the very beginning. So a lot goes in defining in strategizing on what is the right manufacturing and supply chain setup. There's a very close connection with the clinical operations or the commercial operations, because there are no buffers like in
mm.
other situations in between. So I would say that's where probably the focus is much higher as well on manufacturing and supply chain, as much as any other function as well in the radiopharma, but probably a little bit more than maybe in other industries.
Sure, because it's hour by hour, minute by minute.
Correct. Exactly. Exactly. There's no time to wait and waste, let's say. So
Yes.
it's everything is imminent and straight away.
Given all of that and how much of this orchestration relies on various different people and many parties, what kind of role do you see there being for automation in all of this? Everyone's trying to use AI in various different cases, but in traditional manufacturing, it has proven quite challenging in pharma, in a GMP environment, to make AI really work in manufacturing. Supply chain, there've been much more successes. How are you thinking about that?
Yeah. Well, I would say in the same way, right? There's automation that is needed and is going in, and there's a lot of equipment manufacturers that have been working in the recent years in bringing more automation into some of the aspects of either if it's production, but also, as I mentioned, the QC testing, and for sure also on the supply chain logistics side. So that's probably where AI can also support more.
Mhm.
Because of the time constraint, having the oversight of what's happening and almost predictive about what could be the any impacts of situations happening in front, whether it's during, for example, transportation, it could be weather situations, it could be disruptions in the logistics, then any systems that can help see that as early as possible, to either prevent it or to be able to actually implement the plan B or the plan C as quickly as possible become very, very important. So the automation and AI, I think even more important here to be able to support the human intervention. The human touch will probably still always be needed,
Mm.
because there's always so many unpredictable situations that happen, and that being then what are the alternatives that can actually be found, and just maintaining that continuous resilience that we've been talking about during this chat.
Are there any vendors who are doing this particularly well, would you say? Or is it still a case of, cobbling together your own ER solutions and sort of, building your own custom solutions at this
Yeah.
point in the maturity of the industry?
Yeah, I would say there's a mix. So there's definitely some companies who have been working, maybe also very specifically on radiopharma, who have invested a lot in trying to bring together some of the needs that they've heard and have seen that are required. Um, there's probably a lot of mix as well on building something that is customized within each company, because I suppose not having yet, and the modality has many variables to it. So
Mm.
each product, each isotope has a different way of being made. There's different technologies still being implemented. There's still a lot in the making. And so to be able to have a system readily available to manage all this, which is not just the ERP in terms of order management and supply management and cost management, but even the production and the logistics part. That is where probably there's still some work that needs to be done.
Yep.
But there are many companies working on it, so it's promising. Probably, I would imagine that there won't be one size fits all. But probably there will be things like modules that need to be adapted according to each one's need. Almost like a Lego bricks that can be put together depending on what exactly is the situation and the environment that each company is working in.
Yeah. Daniel, we haven't really talked much about ARTBIO itself. It's been fascinating industry overview, but before we wrap this up, it'd be great to understand a bit more about the company that you work for and where you're focused in terms of pipeline. What makes ARTBIO unique?
Well, our bio is unique on maybe a couple of different areas. One of them, we haven't just been making the typical biotech, so different products that can be used to target different type of cancers. But first of all, we've actually been developing also a technology to actually make also the starting isotope. So as I think we've heard many times during our discussion, being one of the key parts
Hmm.
of the actual radiopharmaceutical. In our case, we've focused on a particular isotope, which is called lead-212, which we believe has some advantages compared to maybe some others that are currently being tested or available out there. And at the same time, also making a variety and developing a variety of target molecules that we can be using. The other part that has been quite important in the setup of ARTBIO is also, apart from, so first of all, focusing on one particular isotope, lead-212, building a technology to manufacture this. And because lead-212 is an isotope with a relatively short half-life, which means also a short shelf life, the third component has been actually developing a distributed network, which means having multiple manufacturing centers in each region, relatively close to the point of use. So where
Hmm.
the customer, so being the hospital where the patient will be treated, actually is, in order to distribute the product, reducing as much as possible also the risks of anything happening in between. So these are probably some of the parts that I would say have been very specific about our bio and what we are building.
Certainly getting a lot of headlines and interests in the process.
Yes, I mean there's one side is of course having the isotope itself, and the other part is coming now to actual clinical phase
Hmm.
stages where we have started just end of last year with our first phase one study, which of course makes it then reality and much more interesting.
Very exciting. Finally, Daniel, I wonder if there's any advice that you could share for others who might be interested in, what's happening in this complex, fascinating market and what it takes to succeed. I mean, when you're hiring from people who've maybe worked in traditional pharma or other biologics areas, is there a particular approach that you'd recommend that they take in order to thrive in radiopharma?
Yeah. So I think my personal experience, and this has been my own personal experience as
Hmm.
well, I would recommend that anyone that is either new or also experienced to radiopharmaceuticals approach anywhere they're joining to be very humble with an open mind to I would say to learn, unlearn, and relearn because there is so much that's happening and so much that is still changing. Whether it's because of new modalities, new technologies, new isotopes that have been maybe not so much on the focus in the past, which means that a lot still needs to be learned about them.
Hmm.
So be very much open-minded about this. There are so many opportunities, but this also means that often it requires rethinking of the way of how you've been doing it in the past. It's not just a matter of redoing in the same way.
When it comes to unlearning and rethinking things yourself, are there any books which you're reading or anything which helps you personally change your perspective? How do you do it?
There's probably no textbook, right, that teaches you this kind of thing, but it's having the right partnerships in terms of colleagues, whether it's within the company or also partners on in the industry itself, having those exchanges, talking about it, talking about yeah, how things are just different and how others might be approaching certain aspects. I think that is probably the best way, right? So having the right network, which doesn't necessarily be within radiopharma only, but it's just that right network of people that can help you, coach you, mentor, and just ask the right questions. Of course, there are books about learning, unlearning, and relearning that can help maybe have almost like a self introspection about how to do this. But in the end, is how do you put it into practice? And it's, I think, very much reliant on the colleagues that you have around you and just being open
Yep.
and wanting to do that.
I think that's great advice. I mean, for 2026, it looks like it's going to be another extremely volatile, uncertain year for the world, but equally within all different aspects of pharma, and bringing people together, meeting in person, exchanging with peers is going to be the key, I think, to get through.
Absolutely, absolutely agree.
Daniel, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate the conversation.
Thank you, Luke, and looking forward to hear from you in the near future.